Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started. We're expecting a number of additional people to join us in the next few minutes, but I think we have a critical mass, and so I would like to extend to you a very warm welcome, particularly to the Mind and Life Europe friends and to the Mind and Life Europe Association members and also members of the Community of Contemplative Education, or what we fondly internally and externally call the CCE. For those who don't know me, my name is Cornelius Pietzner and I serve as Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe. So again, thanks for joining us for this special webinar, which follows the publication, the online publication of our Beyond Confines webcast series on education, which we've principally done for our Mind and Life Europe friends. And this first series on education, of which there will be 2 more coming in the next couple of months, is comprised of 7 modules or film clips of about 15 minutes each. And I certainly hope that many of you, if not all of you, have had a chance to look at some, if not all, of these, I think, very worthwhile 15-minute clips of the first series on education. And our intention is that after each series, we would present an interactive webinar like this one this evening, so that you can engage with the presenters directly on what you heard and what you saw in the first series or in the respective series. So this is our first webinar for our first series of the Beyond Confines set on education. And I'm delighted that not only do we have our principal investigator for the CCE with us, Dr. Katherine Weare, who has curated the whole education series, but also some of the distinguished guests on the panel who also very kindly presented for the Beyond Confines webcast series on education. So a particularly warm thank you to our presenters for participating and sharing your expertise and knowledge, not only for the filming of the series, but also for this webinar. So maybe still a brief comment to the format of this webinar. I'm going to turn it over in a minute to Katherine Weare, who will summarize the first series, and then we'll introduce the panelists, who will also provide a 3-minute summary of what they presented in the series, again, to refresh our memories and bring us, so to say, on the same page. So that will take about 20 minutes or so, and then we come straight to the interactive part, because that's really the purpose of this webinar. And we reserved a total of 90 minutes for the whole event. So please feel warmly invited to use the chat function on your screen to type questions to the speakers, which you can do at any time during the presentations. And we'll do our best to moderate these questions, but we'll also invite you, should you so wish, to share your questions directly with any or all of the presenters. Now, maybe a very short word about Katherine as our principal investigator for CCE. Katherine's been working with us now for a number of years to develop the Community of Contemplative Education, and is Emeritus Professor at the University of Exeter in Southampton in the UK. And her career has been, as one might expect, in education, and particularly developing approaches to promoting well-being and addressing mental health problems in young people and those who work with and care for them. More recently, perhaps she's become known internationally for her teaching, research, and evidence review and program development on mindfulness and compassion in education. She is an advisor and has advised various mindfulness projects, such as the UK Mindfulness in Schools project, the Plum Village Mindfulness Community, and the UK government on policy surrounding mindfulness and well-being. She's also co-written a very well-received book with Thich Nhat Hanh called Happy Teachers Change the World, a guide to cultivating mindfulness in education. She's an association member of Mind and Life Europe, and as I've said before, is leading our pan-European hub and platform for the Community of Contemplative Education. So a warm welcome to all of you, our participants, a warm welcome to our panelists, and now I'm happy to turn it over to you, Katherine, for further information.
Thank you. Can you see and hear me, everyone? Is that okay? Great. I've just had a lovely moment scanning across all the faces, and it's a wonderful collection here of old friends and new friends. So it should, I hope, be a really lovely session tonight. So welcome everyone, and delighted to have you here. Cornelius has done a fabulous job in introducing me. When he said Katherine's career, I always expect the word checkered to come up at that point, variable, but he gave a very lovely version of my life. So thank you. That was lovely. I wonder, before I introduce the whole series and then a little bit about what I said in my speech, whether we just have an opportunity for the other panelists to say a little bit about themselves too. That might help to warm things up. Is that okay, folks, panelists there? Just going across the faces then. Caroline, do you want to begin? Because you're the next to the right here.
Certainly. So my name's Caroline Barratt. I work at the University of Essex in the School of Health and Social Care, and I've been particularly interested in contemplative pedagogy in higher education settings. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. That's what Caroline will be talking about. Guy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly, yes. I'm Guy Claxton. I'm a cognitive psychologist by trade. I'm now a retired professor of the learning sciences at King's College, London.
Thank you, Guy. And with an extraordinary number of books to your name by the look of it.
A lot of trees have suffered.
Yes. Dusana, would you like to say hi?
Hi. So I'm Dusana Dorjee. I'm an associate professor in psychology and education at the University of York, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and clinical psychologist. A lot of my work is in developmental contemplative neuroscience.
Thank you. Kevin. You're unmute, Kevin. There you go.
You think you'd kind of remember to do that now.
Yeah, you do, but you never do.
But yeah, my name's Kevin Hawkins. I'm from the UK originally. I'm living in Spain. I've had a long international teaching career, first of all in state schools in the UK, and then teaching in Tanzania and in the Czech Republic. And I've been head of school and school principal as well. And over the last 10 years or more, actually, I've been working increasingly in mindfulness and education and social emotional learning and well-being, working with teachers and students and parents, and especially focusing on teacher training for teachers for their own self-care, which is what I'll talk about this afternoon.
Great, thank you, everyone. Good. We hope that we're a small enough number for people to be able to ask their own questions. So with any luck, we'll get to know more of the faces that make up this this kaleidoscope here. So that will be lovely. So if you do ask a question, do feel free just to introduce your name and a tiny little bit about yourself, because it's nice to build this sense of community. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is do a really brief version of what this series is about and what I covered in the first of the two talks that I gave. We're not assuming that every single one of you has glued yourself to every single thing we've said, so don't feel that you can't ask a question if you haven't looked at all of the webcasts or even any of them. So that's why we're each going to take a moment to summarize what we've said. Okay, so to clarify what the series as a whole is about, the whole thing is about the work of contemplative education in schools and in universities. So all three put together will be exploring the foundations of it, which is what we're doing here, how it's happening in practice, the implementation of it through a whole range of programs and approaches, which will be the subject of the second series. And the third series will be about cutting edges, exciting issues, challenges for the field. So tonight, what this little panel is doing is really talking about some of the foundations. But again, if you've got broader questions, don't worry about that. Just ask whatever you want to ask. But tonight we'll be particularly focusing on what we mean by contemplative education, what some of the very core principles are, and how do we research this area? So I'm going to just kick off a little bit by saying what we mean by contemplative education. The word contemplative probably means something to us people sitting here. It doesn't always make a lot of sense in educational contexts. So when we're explaining what we mean by our model of it, we sometimes unpack it fairly clearly into things that people would recognize. And some of this will be familiar in education and some of it won't. So what we're talking about, and if you're interested in this model, by the way, you can go to our website and you'll see it all beautifully set out in colour by Nina. So, and it's probably a lot clearer than what I'm going to say now. Basically, with contemplative education, we're starting with a holistic view of people, education, society, and so on. Basically a joined up approach. So CE is about a mind and body approach. It's about a sense of connection between ourselves and others. And it's about educational organizations in their fullest sense. And it's absolutely not just about the curriculum. It's not just about teaching kids to be nice to each other. It's the whole ethic, the whole way of being is what we're talking about. When we use the word contemplative, I think we're here particularly talking about work around the inner person, how we help to understand how our minds work, and to put ourselves and as learners at the center of the process. It includes very much some practice. Contemplative education is what you do, not just what you think about. And meditation and mindfulness are fairly fundamental to this. And for many in schools, mindfulness may be the word that they relate to most clearly. But it is also about the ethics that underpin this whole field, the need for social change. And it's underpinned by all kinds of science, not just by randomized controlled trials. So it's quite a broad view of what we mean by contemplative. But any one initiative that you will hear about next in the next series may just focus on a few aspects of this because it can be a bit amorphous, but our model is basically quite broad. So if we said, okay, well, what's the reality of this? What's actually happening in schools? I think, and at universities, I think we recognize that the default is still fairly much the traditional model. We're still talking about something that's a bit fringe and a bit new. Education still remains in most places individualized, competitive, subject-based, knowledge-based. But I think we're working to soften that model and to introduce the contemplative, sometimes straight into it. You don't have to fight the model, sometimes sliding in there and talking about the impacts of, for example, mindfulness on attainment can get you through the door where the contemplative approach can start to do its magic. There's about 35 programs going on across Europe, if you look broadly, and we've got many of them outlined on our website, and they will be being talked about by people, particularly in the next series. And there's quite a lot of research, which I'll talk about in the next little talk I'll give. When we did a little survey of what's happening across Europe, we found it was pretty patchy. In some countries, it's going very well, and in others, hardly at all. Where it's going well is where there is this holistic view of education, where adult mindfulness is well established, and where the government, for example, are starting to understand what this work is about. And in some countries, we have formal networks around contemplative and mindfulness-based education. But there's a lot of barriers everywhere. It's often seen as Buddhism by stealth. There's a lot of concerns about whether it's helpful, whether it's a fad, and so on. So it's not a necessarily very clear picture at the moment, but we're working to try to develop this work across Europe. Okay, that's my little thumbnail of what you'll find if you look at my speech in more detail. There's two very basic principles here, and I'd like to first of all turn to Guy Claxton to explain to us why it's absolutely essential that we start where young people themselves are and not take a very normative view of what we're talking about. Guy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Katherine, and thank you for that really useful and comprehensive introduction. Yes, I think when we talk about contemplative education, if by education we mean what goes on in institutions, mainstream institutions of education, I think it's really important that we think carefully about how contemplative education will connect with the real lives and real concerns of real young people, not some idealized model. We're not training people to spend the rest of their lives in Tibetan monasteries. The word contemplative can sound, in my everyday understanding of it, can sound a bit quiet and a bit introspective. One thinks of monks and nuns and hermits, of people being still and being inward. But I think for most people, and for some people, that will be a lifestyle, if you like. But I think for most people, being contemplative isn't a lifestyle, especially not for most young people. And most young men, as the research tells us, are not naturally drawn towards being reflective and being inward. Nevertheless, I think being contemplative is a very useful mode to have access to. So I would say the way we think about contemplative education is as helping to install in young people's minds, to give them access to this very useful way of, it's a way of learning, really. I think for most of us, what we're after, that contemplative education would be a means to an end. And the end is, I guess, to live fully, to live the good life by whatever way you gloss that for yourself, in your work life, in your relationships, in your leisure. I think fairly obviously that means living according to your, I like the English idiom, living according to your lights, living according to your truest values, living harmoniously, living honestly, being able to pursue your passions and live your dreams, and to like who you are, to live without a great deal of shame or regret. But of course, that's not as easy as it sounds. Some wise person once said, it's simple to be happy, it's just hard to be simple. And I think for us, particularly developed human beings, it is hard for us to be simple. We tend to get mired in our own complexity. We mess up much more than we would like to. We have self-doubt, we have double standards, we acquire in the process of growing up various bugs and various bits of mental malware, and then we get ourselves into a bit of pickle, and we try to deal with that by ignoring these self-inflicted wounds and shutting off or shutting down parts of our lives. And I think this is especially acute for children and young people, people of school age, who are busy creating multiple drafts of themselves, and are subject to all kinds of pressures and nonsense to be materialistic, peer pressures, swamped with images and templates of how to be at the moment, in the process of cutting the ties that bind to family and tradition, of questioning those kinds of things. And as I say, subject to all kinds of, some of it well-meaning, but malign malware, people who are busy telling you who you ought to be and reminding you that you're not who you ought to be. In the face of all that, to kind of begin to approximate to the good life, you have to be able to stop and check in with yourself. Am I on track? You have to be in the debugging business. You have to install in your mind what the writer Ernest Hemingway referred to as a built-in shock-proof crap detector. And I think contemplative education is the mode that we go into when we're doing that. It's like WD-40 for the mind. It enables us to lubricate, to cleanse, to prevent corrosion, and to help us to spot the bugs that we're subject to. So for me, that's what contemplative education is about. It's about building the dispositions for self-correction and for debugging. And mindfulness, of course, is one of the most powerful tools for that. And then we have to think about what enables you to access that mode, to not be frightened of stillness or inwardness, which lots of people, particularly young people, are. If they've learned not to like themselves, it's very hard to face themselves. To stop living manically, to give yourself time for what some religious traditions would call confession and repentance, but those words probably wouldn't cut it with many of today's young people. So I think we're in the business of developing a mindset that values that kind of inquisitive, that calm, inquisitive, but challenging mode. And what interests me in contemplative education is how mindfulness can provide this lubricant, can provide access, so that we can clear away some of the misconceptions, so that we can live more accurately. It's hard to function fully if your understanding of yourself and the world is inaccurate, if it's full of these bugs. So for me, we're in the debugging business, and we're trying to find a way of doing that alongside the history and the maths and the Spanish and the physics that clog the school curriculum. And I think that's the challenge for teachers, how to create an underlay in school which builds young people's disposition for inquiry, and particularly where, as and when necessary, for inward inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Kevin, I'm probably going to need all. I probably set a bad precedent, but I think probably if we're going to let other people have a chat, we probably ought to keep ourselves brief. So, Kevin, you okay with that? Yeah. You're unmute yourself, Kevin.
Oh, for some reason, there we go.
Thank you, Guy.
I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, yes, I'm fine with being very brief. You can interrupt if I'm too long. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, great, thank you.
So my subject is teaching mindfully, and in the webcast I talked about the three aspects of mindfulness and education that we use at Mindwell, and all the work I've been doing with teachers and schools around the world fits into these three aspects. So it's really divided into the first aspect, which is foundation, which being mindful. And when we develop personal practice for ourselves as educators, that begins to impact the way that we teach. So we teach more mindfully. And of course, some people will go on to train in the third aspect of mindfulness education, which is to teach mindfulness to students. But it's really those first two aspects that in our work we've been emphasizing and highlighting all along. I mean, mainly because if you want to engage students in this work, you have to be able to touch into it in yourself, in your own inner experiential understanding of what it feels like to be more mindful, of course, and develop your own practice. But also because for what we've seen in our own experience and the people that we've worked with, it's actually the being mindful, which is really where the power and the transformational aspect of mindfulness education lies, with the adults in the building. And when that begins to impact the way that we teach, the teaching more mindfully, then we begin to see changes in subtly and then more deeply in the culture of our school. So in the webcast, I talk about when we explore teaching mindfully, we can also look at three main areas within that. We look at how does it help us to manage our stress, but also to connect more with our students, to really rediscover that joy of teaching, which many teachers begin to lose after a while. And secondly, how can we optimize the learning environment? So we call on the research in the social neuroscience of education, looking at the role of the teacher and exploring, of course, the concept that deep down, all true learning happens through relationship. And the impact that this can have then on teacher training, on helping young teachers learn to manage behavior by bringing in their own more mindful approach to teaching and learning, begins to impact the way that they teach. And the third area that I look at in the webcast is how this can also impact individual students, talking about reattunement or reattachment from those frameworks. And it's an important aspect that we don't look at very often. The best thing, though, really is to look at the video, because in there's a short clip that I think explains it much better than I could do in a few words by looking at somebody's real life experience. So to summarize, we're not talking just about teachers' own self-care, fundamental though that is. We're really talking about a shift in the focus of our schools, so that we know that schools are in balance, they're reflecting the world, which is basically an imbalance of heart and mind. We produce people who are clever but not terribly wise. And we want our schools to be true places of human development, to provide a more balanced education. And that means a balance of physical, mental, and social emotional aspects of learning, to produce young people who can be wise as well as clever. And as educators, we can all play a part in that shift. We begin with ourselves, beginning to bring in a more contemplative approach that then impacts the way that we teach, then impacts our classrooms and our schools. And then I talk in other places about how this then can really begin to shift the culture and the processes and the fabric of our schools themselves. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Now, we felt it was important to start with the principles, not with the hard evidence stuff, because the principles really are what matter. There's no point in assessing something if it's not doing what you want it to do. So thank you enormously, Guy and Kevin, for establishing those core principles. I'm going to talk incredibly briefly here about what we do know, though, from the hard evidence. There's many ways to investigate contemplative education, and one way is what you might call the medical model, the experimental model, the randomized control trial, where you deliver, usually mindfulness is what's delivered this way, you know, an 8-week program or something of that kind to students of various ages and to teachers. That's the model we're talking about here. And if we take this kind of mindfulness-based initiative model as what we're evaluating with questionnaires and other measures, what do we actually find? Well, it's a cheering picture, really. It does show us that this work is extremely foundational because the impacts it has go right across the human experience. They include well-being and mental health. They include social and emotional learning. They include learning and cognition, physical health, teacher effectiveness. So if you look at the hard evidence, it nevertheless brings us back to this holistic view of humanity. And this kind of evidence is actually very helpful when you're trying to persuade funders or head teachers or administrators that this work is worth doing in schools. So I am a fan of quantitative research alongside work on the principles and the ethics as well. You can also, of course, investigate some of the interesting areas of uncertainty around this. There's not yet enough work around implementation, for example. How do we expand this work without diluting it? How do we develop educational approaches, not medical approaches in schools? How do we create whole school approaches, which is what we will be talking about in the next series? All of this is the subject of interesting research. But I think particularly appropriately in this field, we also need to turn to the first person approach of qualitative research, phenomenology, and so on. And Caroline, I'd like to turn over to you now to explain how we research this kind of area in ways that really respect the inner person and the first person analysis here.
Great, thank you, Katherine. So I'm coming at this as a social scientist with experience in qualitative research, and I came across contemplative pedagogy in 2014 and have been working with ideas around it ever since. And so my video is really thinking about how can qualitative research really help us to understand the impacts and the mechanisms of contemplative pedagogy from all the different perspectives. And the reason I feel really strongly about this is that I think at the moment, the weight of the evidence seems to be quite focused on the research that Catherine's just pointed to, which is really, really important. This kind of looking at the quantitative evidence, randomized controlled trials, really, really helpful for getting that basic level of knowledge. But where I think qualitative research can be very helpful is that it can help us explore the complexity of contemplative education when it's not delivered in the form of an intervention, when we're trying to integrate it into the curriculum, like Kevin was talking about. It also will provide us a way of understanding whether contemplative education is connecting with the needs of the young people, like was spoken about earlier. So I think it's really difficult to know what effect contemplative education is having if we leave qualitative research out. Questions like, how do we know that it's safe? How do we know that it's enhancing learning? How do we know that it's having pro-social impacts? Those are the kind of how and why questions that interpretive qualitative methods can really help us get underneath. And I was really excited to do the video because I have not yet had the chance to really engage in in-depth qualitative research on this topic. So it's a way of hoping to manifest this in my research life, as well as share ideas with others. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. And then the other huge area of research potential, which will be familiar to many of you faces here and Mind and Life friends, is the neuroscience. You know, what's going on inside the black box? What are the mechanisms that explain the outcomes? What's happening when people, you know, qualitatively feel better, they feel more connected? You know, what's actually going on when people are studying this kind of area? And we're very fortunate to have Dusana with us, who is a great expert on this field. So over to you, Dusana, to talk a bit about the neuroscience and the mechanisms.
Right, so in my video, I really try to address the question why neuroscience can be helpful. And I try to go beyond the typical wow factor. So there's an article on the seductive allure of neuroscience explanation. So there's something about neuroscience that mesmerizes people, and they tend to believe that evidence, for better or worse, more than some other evidence. But I think there are more reasons to look into neuroscience evidence in contemplative education beyond that, beyond the persuasive element of neuroscience as such. And some of those reasons I try to outline in the video. And actually how I started doing research in neuroscience with children in schools was because I was very aware of the limitations of self-reports. So when you go under the age of 7 or 8, there is very little you can get in terms of self-reports from children. And therefore we started doing some research where we brought the portable EEG system to schools and started to measure changes in the brain of children in what we hoped would be also a fun way, an educational way for the children. And it turned out to be useful, and it turned out to produce actually kind of good quality evidence. So we were very pleased about that. So a lot of my research program over the last 8 years has been about that. But beyond the limitations of self-reports, I think neuroscience can really help us understand better the causes, the kind of underlying mechanisms of well-being, and the causes of why we respond on self-reports that we are happy or satisfied with our life, or we feel that everything is going well, or we feel that it's the opposite. So those questionnaires typically don't tell us why. And if we don't know why, that's really difficult to fix it or to help support mental health and well-being. And this has been even outside of contemplative research and knowledge as a major gap in our research evidence that is limiting our ability to support young people's mental health and well-being. So I'm very keen to look into the causes with the tools of neuroscience, and in that way understand how well-being works and how it can be changed through neural plasticity with contemplative practice. And in kind of that context, I tend to think about some core mechanisms that are changed by contemplative practice. And in the video, I have particularly talked about what I call the self-regulatory capacity. So this would be the abilities that help us manage our attention, emotions, rumination skillfully in everyday life. And then the second capacity, and again, I think this is where neuroscience is helpful. The second capacity I call existential awareness. And this is kind of a capacity that is rarely mentioned or investigated. What I call existential awareness is our overarching sense of self, an overarching sense of reality that seems to be shifted. Just if you ever have done more than just 20 minutes of practice, you probably know what I'm talking about. That there is a shift in your awareness that kind of permeates how you relate to others, your attention, what decisions you make, and so on and so forth. And our understanding of this shifting sense of self and reality is fairly limited. And in neuroscience, we are also just scratching a surface, but it at least provides a context and kind of conceptual tools, ways of talking about it. And I'm talking not just about neuroscience, I'm talking about cognitive neuroscience. So it kind of goes hand in hand with cognitive research. And we have to think about these mechanisms as embedded in our intentions and our motivations. Again, an area that is heavily under-investigated. And then in relation to our bodies, so how all these mechanisms can impact on the stress response, on our bodily processes, the bodily health, pointing further to the intertwined nature of body and mind. So that's what I like to investigate and like to point to gaps in the research and kind of nudge others to do more research in this area.
Great, thank you. Thank you, panel. Somebody has thanked us for our nice summaries, so we're doing okay so far. We've got a couple of questions coming in here. I'm going to invite the person who asked the question to talk it through, and if you want to say a little about why it interests you, that's fine, but let's restrict ourselves to no more than about a minute or so for each question, if that's all right, and then we can think between the panel who might like to answer that. So I hope I pronounce this correctly. Periananen?
Yes, it's Perianen, but well done, thank you.
I apologize if I got that wrong. Nice to see you.
So thank you very much for the wonderful summaries. So short about myself, I'm a neuroscientist student here in Göttingen, Germany. And my interest is combining meditation and transcranial brain stimulation techniques for treatment of diseases. And my question for today is, the programs that we've been discussing about contemplative education so far, what is the earliest age that this has been implemented, as well as are there any longitudinal studies, which have been implemented from kindergarten? Because this would be really interesting to see how they grow up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll have a little go at answering that to start with, and then pass it over to the panel. I think it's a really good question. I think in terms of longitudinal, no, not yet. It's worth realizing what a very young science this is. We've really only had work going on for about the last decade, and they've been there haven't been time, I don't think, for the longitudinal studies or the funding for them. You can find programs at all ages. In the UK, for example, we have one for 3-year-olds now, which is very nice. The average age, I think, is kind of 9 to 15 is where most of the work's been going on. But there is also some interesting work going on in universities too, when we're looking at what you might call their contemplative pedagogy. So that's the kind of factual answer. I don't know if others in the panel might like to just comment on the work they know about and what they see as the value at the different ages, for example. Anyone like to swing in there, one of our panel?
Yes, sure. I mean, I don't have a strong answer to this, but I think it's a very important question for people who are interested in contemplative education, which is how the nature and the meaning of contemplative education changes and ought to change with the age of the children that we're engaged with. It seems fairly obvious to me that the kind of sort of questioning of cultural assumptions is probably not so appropriate for 3 and 4-year-olds, and would kick in maybe with early adolescence. But having said that, I just while you were talking, Perrin, I was reminded of a workshop somewhere in South America, where little groups of very young children, 4 and 5-year-old children, were being taught in a very gentle discussion to distinguish between what is a need and what is a want. And they were perfectly able to grasp that distinction. And the person doing this study told an amusing anecdote about a little girl the following day who decided that she wanted a toy that one of her friends was playing with, and was hurtling across the kindergarten, just about to try and grab the toy. And she screeched to a halt, and my friend said you could almost see a bubble inside her head. And she actually said out loud to herself quietly, "No, that's a want," and turned around and went away and went. Now, I think that's contemplative education of an age-appropriate kind, but I think we've got a long, long way to go in order to kind of map what that ladder might look like.
Indeed.
Can I come in there, Catherine?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think with contemplative pedagogy in higher education settings, one of the topics that's come up at our network symposium over the last few years is really about the link between critical thinking, critical and radical education, and contemplative pedagogy, and how those join up. So that questioning of cultural assumptions, you know, I think that even at university level, we don't do enough of that. And I think contemplative pedagogy is a kind of an exciting way to really think about how we move from the dominance of critical thinking and that focus on the mind to the inclusion of the whole person, the kind of the whole mess of being a human being, and making that part of our education at the university level, rather than this kind of very detached idea that we can become rational thinking, objective people, and those. So the contemplative pedagogy becomes a balancing factor in higher education, where that dominance of mind, of objectivity, of rational thought, it meets its complement of embodiment, of subjectivity, of inner knowing. And I think that at the moment, that kind of seesaw, if you like, is very one-sided. And I see contemplative pedagogy playing a very important role in that, at that educational level. Thanks.
Something I'd like to bring Dusana in here, if I may, because it's often said that young children aren't capable of metacognition, of standing back from their thoughts. And I think, you know, and there's no point almost in teaching them meditation or metacognition when they're too young, wait till they're teenagers. But I know Dusana's got some really interesting evidence that that's not the case.
Yes, so I have learned the hard way. I mean, going 9 years back, I had exactly the same thoughts that, you know, below the age of 8, what can you do? Because the prefrontal cortex is still developing, the metacognitive abilities are not great, so the ability to observe what is happening in the mind. And I worked with one of the schools where we started doing the first research, and they said, no, that's not the case. And they gave me lots of examples of children coming up to them and reflecting on their cognition and how they're applying the methods in a metacognitive way. And over the years, I have learned that you can go way much lower. One of the kind of program that we have developed recently does start at the age of 3. And the reason for that is that we are shifting from this kind of heavily metacognitive focus on observing the mind towards the embodied way of learning, right? So children, how do they learn? They learn mostly by imitating others, those who are around them, and copying their ways, and so on and so forth. So if they see reactive people around them, that's what they are lovely mirrors, aren't they? So that's what they copy, that's what they embody. And a lot of I remember my younger daughter, a lot of the initial kind of learning comes to them naturally, mindfully, right? So I remember my younger daughter just spending hours playing in a stream, and my older daughter, who is 5 years older, so the younger one was 4 and the older one was 9, was telling her, stop that, come play, and kind of going towards very cognitive and kind of conceptual play. So they have this natural connection with the senses that we don't nourish enough in schools. And I think a lot of the early contemplative education is about letting them be, letting them enjoy that and connecting with those experiences, and teaching adults to be around children in a mindful way so that they internalize that way of being.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go on, Kevin, yeah?
Briefly, so I'm going to agree with what Dusana is saying about a more holistic approach all around it, but I also think that an area that still could do with more research is the impact of mindful awareness training on more traditional metacognitive abilities as learners. You know, the ability of children not just to manage emotions, but also to understand themselves as a learner. What makes me tick? How do I get distracted? What works for me? Did I lose attention when I'm actually trying to read something? Can I bring my attention back? And I know there is a beginning of some research in there, but there's not very much yet. And it feels very likely that there must be a significant potential for a contribution for mindful awareness training to bring greater understanding to our students themselves as a learner, developing a learner profile.
Great, thank you. That turned out to be a very productive question, Perry and Anne. Thank you very much for that. We may have told you more than you wanted to know. Anyway, Michael de Weber has got a very interesting, possibly question, possibly a reflection. Just to introduce Michael, he's one of our most active members in the CCE and one of our most thoughtful members, and it's lovely to have him here. So Michael, over to you if you want to have a reflection rather than a question that's great.
It's both really, but I was intrigued both by your talk saying that we needed in education to move away from a medical model, that one is adopting the medical model from Kabat-Zinn into education. And then I listened to Guy, the talk he had, and I think that is the first time I've heard a consistent way of talking about this, which is not based on the medical model. Your ABCDE, I thought that was fantastic. But now, when you presented, you reverted to the medical model, saying that we are in the debugging business. So, and I have myself worked in the medical model all my life, and I've seen all the harm that it does. And what I now experience is when that creeps into education, it meets a lot of resistance. Why should we say that teachers should treat children and say that children need treating? And so I think that we should really be careful as to how we talk about contemplative education and not revert to the medical model, but look at it as health promoting or life promoting in a real holistic way. So that was my reflection, and also the question to you, Guy. Am I right that you now reverted a bit to the medical model?
Go for it, Guy.
I think I think you're absolutely right. I think the way we talk, the language we choose, is really critical, particularly when we're thinking about engaging young people. But I think the emphases are there, if you like, two sides of the same coin. For me, the primary emphasis, you're quite right, Michael, is on the building, affirming access, daily access, moment-to-moment access to, as I said in my webinar, to certain highly valued, innately valued qualities of experience. And I think that's the right way to, it's about becoming more. It's about accessing and stabilizing something that qualities of experience that contribute universally to what people would call a kind of fully functioning life. But I think it's also true, no, let me say not but, and it's also true that a big part of getting there is not just, as it were, pushing on some kind of accelerator, but you also have to be aware of what the brakes are that prevent us from gaining access to that fully functioning experience. And that's where, I mean, a lot of the religious traditions, particularly Buddhism, talk about this. And that's where I think we have to balance. This is what we want to get to. We want to aspire to a richer, more fully functioning, more fulfilled, more productive, contributory life. But on the way to get there, we need to sift out of our own minds some of the crap that they've accumulated. So I don't think it's reverting to a medical model. I think it's combining a sense of positive ambition for where we would like to help young people get with a realistic understanding of how some of the stuff that they pick up as they grow up is inimical to that full living. And the way to get rid of it, the way we need to do some unlearning on the way to being fully functioning, as well as some new learning or some proto-learning. I don't know, does that help to reconcile the 2 points of view?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions. Great.
Thank you. I wonder if I can just add a little, because your question's a really helpful one, Michael, for us in trying to really formulate clearly what do we mean by contemplative education. And that's something that's been concerning me a lot, trying to really get the right balances. I think what I would say is that I would agree with Guy that there are many ways to approach this, and for me it may be unhelpful to get into dichotomies, medical model or a salutogenic model. I think in a sense they're all, for me, ways of looking at the huge complexity of the mysterious human being on the mysterious planet we all live on. And sometimes putting on a hard-nosed pair of glasses and doing a randomized control trial on something which the Buddha might have understood as human suffering. He was, after all, quite keen to do something about human suffering. I don't know whether you would call him using a medical model or not, is a useful way to do it. If you're saying, how do we help young people with anxiety in the modern world and with depression? That is one facet, one jewel in the, one facet of the diamond that you might say is the whole picture here. And it's a way in that may help in a particular context. But you're absolutely right, Michael, that you also do need to have other ways of looking, much more positive ways of looking that are about capacity and life and energy. And particularly, personally, I rather do like the concept of well-being. I know it's a bit woolly. Someone once said it's like a woolly sweater. It's soft, fluffy, and gets right up your nose. But it's also, I think, a very positive way of looking at humanity, because it brings in all these foundational aspects of what it is to be alive. And if using a medical model or a deficit model can get funding for a project to get into a school that it wouldn't have got in otherwise, and then contemplative education, mindfulness, starts to do its magic and helping people to realize that there's a lot more to mental health than the pathogenic model, that it is about life and it is about affirmation. I'm quite happy to, in a sense, get this work going in whatever way it makes sense. But I completely endorse your view, Guy, and yours, Michael, that how we talk about this is just so really important. So I think this has been a really fascinating little conversation. I wonder if any other panel members want to put their hat in the ring on this one.
Could I, if nobody's going to jump in, can I just add a tailpiece to this very, very, very quickly, which is, I think, from my personal experience, my experience of practicing mindfulness and studying a bit of Buddhism, is that it's shifted my perspective around this from seeing the bugs in my own mind from a sort of remedial point of view to just actually seeing them as interesting.
Yeah.
That it becomes an interesting inquiry rather than a cry for help.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just add, from seeing students working with this and children in schools and teachers, I think you're both right. Both sides are correct. This is a universal intervention that can have tremendous benefit for some people who are struggling in severe ways. But in terms of how kids receive it and first engage with it, I really like also Guy's talking about the kind of qualities that kids are interested in. That's what needs to draw them in. And if you start with a deficit model for general introductions, you're in danger of losing more kids along the way than you need to. So when we empower teachers to bring it in a meaningful way and frame it in a way that makes sense for them and for their kids, and that framing is not a spin, it's so important to find ways that people could connect with it, because it is so adaptable. It can apply to such different populations. So when you bring that context of your local community in, and you're speaking from the heart as yourself, as an educator who's touched into this, not an expert in the human condition, we're on a pretty level playing field with kids when we're trying to explain, how does my mind work? How do my emotions work? How does my body work? And how do these things sometimes trip us up in life? That's part of the beauty of working in this way with young people. So I do feel that just finding that way in is so key, and taking the time before you jump into a program with a school. You can actually turn kids off if it's done in a clumsy way, in a less skillful way.
Now we've had two very long answers to two fascinating questions. I'd like to encourage everyone, in the group if they want to throw a few questions in, everyone here. So I'm going to encourage the last few questions that we have at the moment, and hoping we'll have more, to be answered quite quickly, I think. And the first one may be fairly easy to answer quickly because it's a question from Regular to Dusana. So Regular, do you want to put your question?
Thank you. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm interested in children's self-regulation and metacognition. So we already answered we already touched upon this question in response to the first question. So, right, John Flavel investigated the development of children's introspective abilities. And Dusana, you said before with your example of your younger daughter playing in the river, being already in that state. So my question is, well, in terms of existential awareness, would your daughter already have this existential awareness that then as adults we kind of have to develop again with contemplative practices? So it's really that developmental aspect of existential awareness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Regula. It's a very interesting question and one of my core research interests. So I think of existential awareness as a continuum of separable shifts. So it is not just you have it or you don't have it. And what Flavel talks about is more metacognitive awareness in terms of being able to observe rather than this overarching shift that I have in mind. So, for example, the kind of common shift that is studied in the literature is the difference between being immersed in our thoughts. And again, we all experience that, right? When we are consumed with our thoughts, we identify with them. And now compare that from kind of the existential awareness state when you step back after practice and suddenly kind of your perspective widens and you are kind of disidentifying with your thoughts. There is a sense of space between your thoughts and kind of your engagement, your involvement in them. So decentering is one example of a shift in existential awareness, but in in the recent work that I've been doing over the last 3 years, we have described at least 9 other steps. So we are starting with immersion, and the highest level is, pristine awareness. So it's enlightenment, really, in other words. And on the way, there are many other states in between. And some of these states are kind of unhelpfully, I think, really mixed into explanations of mindfulness and so on, with terminology and so on and so forth currently. So we have been trying to kind of distinguish these states more carefully in adults, and I have developed a measure that we are now currently validating actually for these mechanisms that I have described, including existential awareness. It was a very difficult task. We are using kind of short descriptors of the states rather than just simple, statements as in self-reports, because I really believe these are holistic states. So we're trying to validate those, and the next step will be trying to validate these in children so that we can look at the developmental progression and think of it, for example, in children from this ability to step back, then to the ability to widen the perspective. So it's not just our little bubble, but the kind of sense of care and connection widens. And then think of it about the sense of self that is growing, that kind of is not solidified and unchangeable and one that we grasp to, but there's a wriggle room, right? So that it kind of has flexibility and expands. And then there are further and further levels all the way to emptiness of self and so on and so forth. So I don't think about it as one thing. And I think it's the same thing as what Flavel says. I think what Flavel says is more, in my thinking, linked to self-regulation, which is a prerequisite for all this to happen. I think that's it. I shouldn't talk more.
Thank you so much.
Dusana, thank you. Wolfgang, I know you have a question, and I'm going to suggest that Caroline, if you don't mind, you answer this one as the person who leads the network on contemplative pedagogy. Mm-hmm. So over to you, Wolfgang. Oh,
okay, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit like a question into the future. That is, assuming that this wonderful work that you present matures further, reaches more and more young, children and young adults. through contemplative education and contemplative pedagogy, I would expect and hope that many of them, or some of them, would be eager to integrate contemplative practices, contemplative values into their lives. And then going into the professional world, which is in a way, you could say, still stacked against that in a way, not really providing much of a space for continuing and supporting that, and particularly in academia and research itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wanting to ask you, I wanted to ask you if you have any ideas, hopes, or wishes into how the work that you're doing could extend in the future also into this area, or how a bridge could be made towards what you could call maybe a mindful, compassionate, contemplative academia and a community of researchers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, what a brilliant question. And it's more of a question that I'm living rather than a question that I feel I can answer. But so I set up something called the Contemplative Pedagogy Network in 2014, which is specifically a network for higher education professionals, academics and research, sort of teachers and researchers in the HE context. And I agree that the current institutional environment is very counter to a lot of the values and the way that we'd like to be. But I think the one thing I found since really developing the network is that there are some inspiring green shoots of hope that kind of keep me going when my back's against the wall in a kind of environment that I find really challenging. And I think firstly, meeting with other educators in any sector, but particularly someone that really feels that working in a university kind of environment with the pressure to teach and the pressure to do research has been really, really helpful. So the fact that I know that there are other people that have the same values and are trying to work in similar ways to me has been a huge, huge resource. And coming together with those professionals and actually practicing together as well is a really powerful thing for sustaining my inspiration and my desire to continue sort of embedding that integrity and quietness and depth of practice in my professional life. So there's a couple of things that kind of give me reason for hope. And what I think has been lovely about your comment that I've never thought about before is that we could be creating generations that actually have different expectations of their work lives. And that for me is amazing when I think about the potential impact that could have on the future of academia. If we have people coming into academia with very different expectations, I think that will help to kind of fuel this change over kind of generations. So yeah, there's so much more I could say, but yeah, it's a great question.
Yes, I think your question, Wolfgang, which causes us to reflect on ourselves, to stop commenting on everyone else, which we're all very good at doing, and actually say, well, what are we doing in our own work, is a really interesting one. And just something to share, which is a lovely exercise Mind and Life Europe itself went through a year or so back, where it really clarified its values. And we looked at how we treat each other, and we have now a set of values cards, which if you haven't got them or seen them, they're on the website, well worth downloading, which we use a lot when we're trying to have conversations. And when things are going well, or before we start, or when things are going badly, we'll hold up a card, radical candor, embracing joy, whatever. And it was a really helpful exercise. So I think that's a really good question that I think we should all keep asking ourselves, never mind everyone else. What are we doing in our own work life, in the way we treat the people around us, we work with and we live with? It's such a valuable question, Wolfgang. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, we don't have any more questions in the chat room. I don't know if anyone wants to throw one in. Just
I have one.
Go for it.
If I may, a short one. Is that all right, Catherine? I'll just jump in here. It's actually a question to Guy. I've heard you speak on a couple of occasions about, and we've mentioned it here now too during this broadcast, about the languaging that we use, particularly a language that is relevant for younger people, that isn't too highfalutin or too abstract or too awkward. So for teenagers and others. I guess my question is for post-teenagers, you know, kind of up to 30, and people who are actually, or so, who are engaging in already in professional life. What is your experience? Are there people out there who have already adopted this really actively? You know, I mean, there are a bunch of us older folks, slightly older folks who are promulgating this sort of a thing. But is your experience here that there's a, you know, a growing contingent of people, particularly in the education domain, who are like in their 30s and young teachers and adopting this? This would be my question.
The short answer is no, actually. I don't have a strong sense. I mean, it's sort of, in my mind, this links back to Wolfgang's question. I don't have a strong, it's easy not to be optimistic about the progress that we're making. And I've come to treat, this is partly a survival strategy for myself, I've come to treat schools and universities as dysfunctional but highly robust organisms that resist perturbation very, very successfully. And so it's like, you know, often when you're, I was going to say, trying to change a system, like, let's use that language for the moment, it's like for a long time nothing seems to be happening. And they're like little, like someone said, the green shoots or something or other, but it's not scaling up. And then maybe eventually, and it's easy to become despondent. You know, there are these little pockets of, you know, CCE and what have you, but the mainstream seems monolithically resistant to what's going on. But I just think we need to, you know, we need to remain optimistic about how the green movement shifted. For a long time, it was treated as fringe or nutty or marginal. And the simple image that helps me keep going day to day is of like walking up a seesaw. You know, as if you walk up a seesaw from one side, it's like you're just plodding uphill and nothing much is happening until one little step more, and suddenly the whole thing tips. And now you're walking downhill rather than uphill. And I think, you know, our hope should be that our efforts, even though they may not be seeming to have enormous benefit, are contributing to that tipping point becoming nearer. That was part of your question, and the other part was to do with the nature of the language. I think people in their 20s and 30s, that stage of life is often, not by no means always, but is often more about kind of making your way in the world and family. This is like back to Jung's idea of like the different stages that we go through in our development. And it's, you know, it's only later on old folks like you and me, Cornelius, who are kind of, you know, have the leisure or the inclination to you know, to dig more deeply. And I think maybe some young people have that too, but I think it may just be in the nature of the stages of life that the age band that you identify is probably going to be more about making it in one way or another rather than questioning it. And there are lots of exceptions to that rule, but as a very broad generalization.
I'd like, if I may, to also direct that question to Kevin, because I know Kevin's in and out of schools a lot and working very closely with educators. Kevin, what's your impression of the answer to Cornelius's question?
I mean, if you're just talking about mindfulness in education and are people interested in wanting to bring it into their lives and into their schools, I would say working internationally, you know, the last 10 years, it's gone from zero interest to thinking that you're crazy till you mention it, to almost everybody's doing it in international schools, certainly. And they tend to be a little bit ahead of the curve in some of these areas and behind in others. But in fact, in some ways, it's more, you know, are people jumping too quick and not engaging with it deeply enough and then wanting their kids? So I think what's happening is people see the need for it, like the green movement, you know, now, of course, we see the need for that more directly. And with big concerns about mental health of young people and sometimes terrible events that happen in schools, then schools know they have to do something more about well-being and safeguarding of students. So and then you get individual teachers, these champion teachers who have touched into something very real and who start to do something in a school and it sometimes goes nowhere. Sometimes when it gets support from above, you know, it really begins to spread amongst other people, and then they look around for a way to make this more real. So I would say, from what we see, there's a lot happening, and a lot of young people, young educators who do get the value of this. I mean, in the UK now, the fact that the government is telling people they have to teach mindfulness in some areas, that can be bad as well as good, of course, but they're bringing in big programs there. So the awareness of it has grown considerably, I think.
Yes, I would agree with that, having done quite a lot of work across the UK. It's often easier in primary schools in the state sector than it is in secondary schools. State secondary schools are a really difficult one in the UK at the moment. But it's certainly increasing in primary schools, and particularly if you look at the attitudes such as compassion and kindness, if you look at educators' understanding of concepts like metacognition or self-regulation, this language is developing quite fast. Brigitte, you wanted to make a comment, I think, because you work in an international school. Would you want to tell us your experience there on this question?
Thank you, Catherine. I just wanted to back what Kevin said. I am the head of HR at an international school in Switzerland in the Zurich area. And I feel exactly the same. Not everybody yet knows what it is, but the interest is increasing a lot. And time is helping us because everybody sees the need that we do something on the mental health side. The numbers are not going in a good direction with mental health, not with the employees and not with our students. That's sad to see, but of course it helps the topic become a priority.
Which of course links back to Michael's observation and to that discussion about whether you start with the problems or whether you start with the positive. Sometimes you just have to start with the problems in order to get the positive attitude going.
Catherine, can I ask you
please.
something that you just mentioned? You said it's harder at secondary schools, and we teach 3-year-olds through to 19-year-olds. And I interestingly also find our upper school the hardest nut to crack. I encounter resistance, and they want to do their own thing, and I think they are prima donnas. And what is your perception of what do you encounter in secondary schools?
I think the core difference I see is that often, to be very stereotypical, primary school teachers teach children and secondary school teachers teach subjects.
Yeah.
And that's where their allegiance lies. Now, that's a terrible generalization, but that tends to be one, and I think that's something we need to both work with and understand, but also to tackle. I don't know what others feel about that gross generalization.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, makes sense to me. It's sort of, I am a math teacher and that's so important. You cannot expect me to care about anything else but math, right?
Yes, that can be the mindset.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
There's another major factor and a very obvious one, which is the pressure of the high stakes tests and the external exams, which requires whatever their private feelings might be, requires high school teachers to be very focused on the kind of intellectual and the rational that Caroline was talking about earlier on. And, you know, and many teachers I met will say, yes, with the best will in the world, but you know, we've got Ofsted breathing down our neck. We've got the pressure of GCSEs or International Baccalaureate Diploma or whatever it may be. I think one other thing I wanted to add, which is I think international schools are special and precious because they're more entrepreneurial and they're more likely to be staffed by mavericks.
Good. We all like a good maverick guy. Something we're finding in the UK is helpful is to be promoting the idea of contemplative and mindfulness-based approaches as impacting on teaching and learning at a very deep level. And that can very much engage the interest of secondary school teachers and university teachers. If you start talking about what is it to learn, how do we increase critical awareness, how do we increase the awareness of our own biases and our own prejudices, if we go in through that rather cognitive route, which you may say, well, where's the emotion in there? But if you get that Trojan mole, that Trojan horse through the door of that interest in cognition and improving the quality of thought and discernment and judgment, that can often be quite a good way of unlocking the contemplative, and then it expands out from there into the emotional and the spiritual and so on. I think that's one way to achieve that. Caroline, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think also just drawing on that, my experience has been that sometimes even talking, particularly in higher education, talking about contemplative pedagogy is a bit of a barrier, because it's like, well, what does that mean actually? And actually doing something that's much more applied. So one of the best workshops that I've done was about using silence in teaching and learning. So I didn't go in with a kind of contemplative pedagogy kind of framework, if you like. It was much more applied with a few very practical ideas about how to bring more space into your teaching and learning. And I think that's, when I think about talking to people about these ideas, it's very contextual. I really think about who I'm talking to now in a way that I didn't used to when I first found out about it and was all excited. So I just wanted to share that, because I think teachers are very applied types of people. They want to know how it looks in their teaching for their students. And the more that we can do that and help them join up the dots, I think it's just really helpful.
Good, Caroline. Now, I think we've come to the end of the questions in the chat room, and a couple of folks have had to go, which is quite understandable. It's been quite a long session. I wonder whether it might be wise to pull it together at this point and to thank people. We don't want people to be drifting off. Uta, is there any hope possibly of getting these very interesting questions in the chat to people? That would be, Uta's nodding, because I think the questions themselves have been fascinating. And just to comment for myself, I've learned more from the questions, I think, than I've certainly learned from hearing myself talk. I get that. And from the other panelists. So I've found it a very fruitful way of spending an hour and a bit. I think it's been, for me, very nourishing and very thought-provoking. So I'd like to thank everyone who's taken part in that. I don't know whether the other panel members have just got a final observation.
Maybe a closing word, right, from each of the panelists, including you, Katherine, on the subject would be great.
Yes, I think that was my closing word. But I think for me, I think what it's brought out is this notion of this is foundational. This is absolutely core to what we're trying to do. This is not just about odd outcomes about this, that, and the other. It is about what it means to be a human being, and how do we help our young people and our teachers to really develop fully as full human beings. But pragmatically, we've got to go into this through a whole range of doors. And if it takes a particular way of looking at it or a particular approach, we've got to talk to teachers in ways they understand and to young people in ways they understand. So it's always this balance between pragmatism and idealism. And that, I think, is what we've been playing with throughout this panel. So thanks to everyone. Other members?
I'd like to thank people for being here. And I mean, I think just the situation that we are in as a species at the moment, one of the most precious things we can do is to raise awareness, our own and other people's. So if we can find ways to do that with a spirit of kindness and curiosity around learning, and build up children's ability to notice what's happening in themselves and in the world, and learn to take care of themselves, of each other and the planet, then that has to be key to what's necessary at this moment. And I really appreciate people's interest in this whole area.
Thanks, Kevin. Guy, have you got a final thought?
I wanted to echo what you were saying about the sort of the necessary tension, really. I mean, we are talking about, ultimately, we're talking about a really radical paradigm shift in education, and it's complex, and there are many resistances, some of them neurotic, some of them institutional and structural. And in that context, there's always going to be a tension between the realos and the fundis. And, you know, and in each of us, we shift backwards and forwards between those two stances. I know I do. But it's, you know, it's big business, and it's very, I think it's important what we're doing. So I'd like to say amen to Kevin's coda to this session, which I thought was very well said.
Thank you. Dusana, you've got a final thought?
For me, I think what kept on kind of appearing in my mind as we were discussing, as I was listening to everybody, and thank you all for the interesting questions, for the interesting discussion, was the thought of building bridges. So that how important it is that we don't slip into our own persuasions about even mindfulness and contemplative practice, and how important it is to build bridges with others, with the system. And I don't think within the field, at least kind of within the research, we are doing enough of it. So there is our little field and our little groups, and there is our little group right here. But there are all the other people who don't think this way. 3 days ago, I got feedback on one of my grants that was all but mindful, very judgmental, very personal, and very not what we are talking about here. So building bridges, I think, is the theme for me, and kind of trying to invest more time and energy in that. And I do hope that neuroscience has a place in it, because often it kind of provides more grounding and makes these practices look a little bit less fluffy, as some people would say, even for teenagers sometimes. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, brilliant, lovely. Caroline, final thought?
Just how lovely it's been to spend a bit of time focusing on this. I think for lots of us, this is part of a much bigger job that we do, and we don't get as much time as we'd like to really focus on this. And it's lovely that so many people have made the effort to be here. And I think I've just gone away with thoughts about, firstly, the integrity of my own practice in a difficult institutional environment, and how much power I might give up with regards to that. And also thinking about this the language that we're using, and particularly whether we use this kind of health model and what the alternative to that is. And yeah, just reflecting that some models may be more dominant in my mind than others, and do I want to change that? You know, what's my kind of main way of understanding it? And I'm sure there are many others. So yeah, lots to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. And Cornelius, perhaps you might like the final word, as having sat through this.
You're muted.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, we never learn, us old guys. No, on behalf of Mind and Life Europe, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for giving up your time and your experience, and not only for this evening now for this hour and a half, but also for the webcast, and to all of the rest of you who have also given up your time to participate. You know, we do see this as really foundational, and not only our webcast, you know, which is really following from our Beyond Confines Contemplative Science Symposium that we held outside of Munich in October 2019, but altogether, you know, a priority work of Mind and Life Europe, which is in this area of contemplative education. It's not for nothing that we've made this into our primary hub, if you like, or primary active initiative. And although we ourselves aren't particularly promoting, or shall I say, selling any one product or another, the idea of creating a platform, a pan-European platform to bring together experts such as yourself and many others, seems to me, when I look at society's problems, to really, and taking a long view, to be one of the most important things we can really do. You know, I'm not going to get lost in talking about the recent elections in the United States, but I will say one thing in that regard, which is that the thing that shocked me the most was how divided the country was. And one of the things that shocked me secondarily was that politicians might even have the presumption to think that they could solve such an issue. And I think this is really something for an education. You know, here we're really looking mid and long term. And I think the kind of work, the kind of values, the kind of inputs that we're trying to promote and you're trying to promote and we're trying to learn from seem to me to be a major and important contribution to our civil society development. So, well, you're hearing from me personally in this regard, but that's the way I feel, and that's the way I see this work, and that's the way I see your contribution. So it's a heartfelt thank you to all of you. And on that note, I wish you a right good evening. And again, thank you for your participation, all of you.
Thank you,
So,
Cornelius.
good night. Bye-bye. We'll keep this on still live for 1 minute or so. I think we're about to throw up a slide, but if not, for those who want to still chat or talk, we still have a minute to do so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.